My talk is based on my recent book, Empty Cages, Facing the Challenge of Animal Rights. And I begin my talk by reading from the preface of that book. A few years ago, the Home Box Office Network, HBO, aired a program entitled To Love or Kill, Man vs. Animals. It told a fascinating and at the same time a disturbing story about how different cultures treat the same animals differently. One especially chilling segment took viewers to a small Chinese village where they went to dinner. You know how in some restaurants patrons get to choose from among live lobsters or fish, and how after they make their selection, the animal is killed and the chef cooks a meal of their choice. At just Chinese restaurants, things are the same except the menu is different. At this restaurant, patrons get to select from among live cats and dogs. The video takes its time. First, we see the hungry patrons inspect the cats and the dogs. Next, we see them make their selection. Finally, we see a man yank a cat from the cage and hurry into the kitchen. While the cat scratches and claws, the cook hits her several times with an iron bar. Clawing and screeching more now, she is abruptly submerged in a tub of scalding water for about 10 seconds. Once removed and while still alive, the cook skins her from head to tail in one swift pull. He then drowns the traumatized animal, throwing her into a large stone bath, where, as the camera zooms in, we watch her gulp slowly, with increasing difficulty, her eyes glazed, until her last breath taken, she dies. When the meal is served, the diners eat heartily, offering thanks and praise to the chef. I had never been more stunned in my life. I was literally speechless. Like many Americans, and of course many Greeks, I already knew that some people in China, Korea, and other countries eat cat and eat dog. The video didn't teach me any new fact about dietary customs. What was new for me, what pushed me back in my chair, was seeing how this is done, seeing the process. Watching the awful shock and suffering of the cat was devastating. I felt a mix of disbelief and anger welling up in my chest. I wanted to shout, "Stop it! What are you doing? Stop it!" Now, I believe that my response to what I'll refer to as the cat episode is no different from the response that any of you in this room would have to that same event. Because I think we share a common core of compassion, in the face of which, when we see what happens to the cat, all of us would want to intervene. All of us oppose what's going on. All of us would want to help. All of us would want to stop what's being done to the cat. So we share this common core of compassion. And what's important to realize is that this is not just Americans and not just Greeks who feel this way. Increasingly, what we find is that people in China, people in Korea are standing out on the streets protesting this tradition, this practice of eating cat and eating dog, as the video summarized. They are opposing, they are intervening, they are helping, they are wanting to stop what's going on. Now, animal rights advocates, and I consider myself to be one, we generalize on the cat episode, if I can call it that. Other things that are being done to animals, we want to oppose. Other things that are being done to animals, we want to intervene. Other things that are being done to animals, we want to stop. We want to help them and we want to stop their exploitation. And so an animal rights advocate, properly understood as I understand the concept anyhow, is not a reformer. We're not out to try to make something better while keeping it. We're not out to try to say, oh, if only we could treat them more humanely, it'd be okay to still raise animals for fur, or still raise animals to train them in the circus. We're not trying to keep the practice and reform it. What we are after is we're abolitionists. We're out to stop the various forms of human exploitation and abuse of other animals. Stop it. What are you doing? Stop it. That's what we're all about. But the question is, how do we get this way? Because what I know, what you know, is that we're in the minority. Not all the world consists of animal rights advocates. A very small percentage of us are animal rights advocates. And so you have to wonder, how did we get this way? And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. I don't think there's just one way someone gets to become an animal rights advocate. I think there are at least 3 different explanations. Let me share them with you. One possibility that leads a person to be an animal rights advocate is what I call the Da Vincian possibility, the Da Vincians. Now, we all know Leonardo da Vinci because of his famous paintings, the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. What most people don't know is that Leonardo was an animal rights advocate. Now, he didn't use those words because they were not part of the vernacular of his time and space. But he was, in terms of his sensibilities, an animal rights advocate. For example, from a very early age, as a young boy, he stopped eating meat once he realized where it came from. And he ridiculed his peers as he grew older. He said, "You make of your stomach a tomb for animals. When you eat them, what do? You bury them in your stomach, is what you do when you eat an animal. You make of your stomach a tomb for animals," he said. In fact, Leonardo went so far as he stopped drinking milk because that was theft. He stopped eating eggs because that was theft. He stopped all intake of animals. He became a vegan. Now, this is a little known fact about Leonardo, but it's an absolute truth about him. And another example of his animal rights sensibility, he would go into the markets, and they had caged birds, and he would buy the birds from the vendor and then release them, set them free. Not larger cages for those birds, empty cages in the case of those birds. So Leonardo is an example of how some people become animal rights advocates. And the thing that's significant about the Da Vincians is they seem to have a natural compassion and empathy. It's not something you have to teach them. It's not something that is based on proof. It's not like, well, if you could prove it to me, I would respect animals, or give me an argument and convince me. No, it's not something they figure out. It's almost as if it's in their genes. It's something they bring to the world, it seems. And I've known some people, and so has my wife, known some people in our lifetime who we've met as animal rights advocates who were Da Vincians. They just brought this sensibility to them as children. Didn't need to teach them, didn't need to convince them, they were just that way. A second way that some of us become animal rights advocates, I call the Damascens. You know the story about Saul on the road to Damascus in the Bible. Saul is called up to Damascus by other people who are detractors of Jesus. And what's happening in Damascus is that people are starting to listen to Jesus. And so the detractors of Jesus say, we got to do something about this. So they say, Saul, come on up here to Damascus, and you're a good preacher. Preach against Jesus, and let's put a lid on this pot before it boils. And on the road to Damascus, so the biblical story goes, Saul hears this voice speaking from the heavens. and there are various artistic expressions of what happens here. But Saul hears this voice speaking from the heavens, saying to him, Saul, Saul, why dost thou forsake me? And it's Jesus' voice speaking from the heavens to Saul on the road to Damascus. And, of course, this has an incredible impact on Saul. And on the basis of this single experience, Saul, the principal detractor of Jesus, becomes Paul, the principal apostle of Jesus. So Damascans, as animal rights advocates then, would have been going along in life, living their life in a certain kind of way, and then they have this life, this transforming, life-altering experience, just as Saul did on the road to Damascus. They have a new consciousness. They have this sense, not something based on proof again, it's something that happens to them, rather than something that they figure out. I'll give you an example of someone that we've met during the 40 years we've been involved in the struggle for animal rights who had a Damascus moment. This man's name was Heinz, and he lived in Berlin, Germany. And he was a young boy during the Second World War. And what would happen was when the Allies would bomb, everybody would go into air raid shelters or into basements and until the bombing cleared, the sirens were heard and they knew it was safe to come out. So after one particular long siege, the sirens rang and Heinz comes out. He's about 10 years old at the time. And he's standing there, and you know what a horse sounds like on cobblestone streets, on stone streets, when the clickety-clop of a horse as they come down the street. Well, Heinz comes out of the basement, and here he hears this horse running towards him. Tap, 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 tap. At a very fast pace. And then running straight at Heinz, this 10-year-old boy, a big horse. And the horse is on fire. From his nose to his tail. It's just a ball of fire. And what had happened apparently was that some gasoline had been poured on him somehow and caught fire. And so here comes this blazing horse running right at this 10-year-old boy, Heinz. And just before he is about to run over him, he veers and saves him. But as he does so, he looks Heinz in the eye. His eye, the horse's eye, looks Heinz in the eye. And Heinz was transformed. He was a new person. From that day forward, the meaning of his life was, what can I do to help animals? What can I do? Because the horse, as he goes by, Heinz said, it was as if the horse said to me, why aren't you helping me? What have I done to deserve this? So there are some animal rights advocates who are Damascans, who are transformed like that. So we have the Da Vincians who are born that way, and we're the Damascans who are transformed that way. And then we have what I call, well, let me elaborate a bit on what I mean by this Damascus experience. You know, if you look at this, what do you see? What do you see in this image?
Holy Grail.
A vase, right? But then you can see two faces, right? So a change of perception is when, like, I only always saw things this way, a vase, and then you have a change of perception. Oh, wait a minute, there are two faces there. I can see there are two faces there. So what happens when Damascans have a change of perception is that it changes who they are. It's like they become a new person in the world, and instead of seeing other animals as something to be turned into food, they see them as sociable creatures. Or instead of seeing them as something to be turned into clothes, they see them as models of stoicism, cows in a field. Who can be more stoic than a cow in a field? And instead of seeing them as something to train to entertain us, they see them as someone who's wise in the ways of the world. Instead of seeing them as something to vanquish. They see them as families to be protected, and instead of seeing them as something to turn into tools, Damascus see them as exemplars of intelligence. A change of perception. In these and countless other ways, Damascans, who are animal rights advocates, have a change of perception in the blink of an eye, a change that extends to all their relationships with other animals. So again, as I say, we have the Da Vincians, and we have the Damascans, and then we have what I call the muddlers. And the muddlers are people who are just going on through life, nothing terribly exciting. But they start to learn something about what's happening to animals in the world. Perhaps they come to an event like this and they see the video, or they hear what somebody says, and they start to think. A muddler is someone who doesn't get there very fast. It's kind of just muddling along, which means you're just kind of you're moving in a certain direction, but slow. So there's no Damascus moments here. Muddlers, nothing in the genes and nothing dramatic or transforming. They just muddle along. And what happens with a muddler, and I say this as a muddler, because I'm no Damascus moment in my life and no Da Vincian genes in my body. What happens with a muddler is you start thinking about stuff, and you start experiencing stuff too. Like I say, an example would be today. Somebody sees one of those images in one of those films, and they think, what is going on there? And they find out the answer to that question. But that question leads to another question. Well, what is a fur farm? What is a factory farm? What is the Dre's test? What is the LD50? All these questions keep cropping up, and a muddler just muddles along. And if you complete the journey, if a muddler, all moving slow, but if a muddler finally gets there, what happens is there is a change of perception. What happens is one day you look in a mirror and you see an animal rights advocate looking back at you. It takes time. For muddlers to say, this is not my next meal, and this is not where my clothes are coming from, and this is not an acceptable form of family entertainment, and wild animals don't exist, so we can kill them in the name of sport. Animals should not be treated as models of human diseases. It takes a time. Now, the one thing that I think is common between all those three kinds of ways of getting to be an animal rights advocate, Da Vincian, Damascus, muddler, is we all believe that animals have rights. That's what the kind of bottom line proposition that we're willing to affirm. The question is, do they? Now, one thing we know about this question, it's a very important question, and we're not going to find an answer to it in the media or in opinion polls or in unexamined traditions. For example, if you go to opinion polls, perhaps you say, take an opinion poll, how many people think that animals have rights? In the United States, it's something like 8%. Well, if you thought that answers the question, you say, well, most people don't think animals have rights, therefore they don't have rights. Opinion polls would settle the issue. But opinion polls don't settle the issue. I mean, 92% of the people can be mistaken. I mean, usually there was a time when everybody thought the world was flat. And everybody was mistaken. So opinion polls in the media or unexamined tradition are not going to do it. The only way we're going to find a satisfactory answer to the question, do animals have rights, is by accepting the invitation of philosophy, by thinking independently. And what is the invitation of philosophy? Philosophy's invitation is to think for ourselves. It's the greatest, no other discipline gives us this gift. It says, think for yourself. I mean, don't start with the assumption that there are experts. Think for yourself. Of all places where this is a profound truth, justly honored, the city of Athens, the birthplace of philosophy. And we're to think for ourselves, we're to muddle along using logic and being factually informed, not being ignorant of how animals are being treated, and also not just being subject to strong emotional pulls. We're to free ourselves from prejudice if we're to make any advance on the question, do animals have rights? And really the purpose of my remarks today, the reason I'm here, and along with my wife Nancy, the purpose of my remarks is to extend this invitation to everybody. Let's all think for ourselves, being factually informed, using logic, and freeing ourselves from prejudice as we try to answer the question, do animals have rights? The role of rights, how do rights function in our moral thinking, in our moral life? Well, think about it. Rights protect our most important goods, our life, our body, our liberty. That's their function. Their role is to protect our most important goods, our life, our body, and our liberty. Rights limit freedom. They're like invisible no trespassing signs. Your rights limit my freedom. There are certain things I'm not free to do, else I violate your rights. If I'm not at liberty for no reason whatsoever except for my pleasure to injure your body, your right to bodily integrity protects you in that respect, and society recognizes that. And my rights limit your rights. Your rights limit your freedom as well. So this essential function of rights is limitation on another's freedom, a limitation on another's freedom. Rights take priority. Rights take precedence over other important moral considerations. They're what we call the trump suit, if I could use the expression, in the game of morality. I know some of you might not be familiar with the game with the trump suit, but I'll give you an example of what I mean. In the game of bridge, for example, a certain suit will be determined to be the trump suit. Let's suppose in this particular hand we're playing the diamonds or the trump suit. And so the first player plays the queen of spades, next the king of spades, third the ace of spades. I'm the last player. I don't have any spades, but I do have the two of diamonds. In a game like bridge, that two of diamonds, when diamonds are trumped, is more powerful than the queen of spades, more powerful than the king of spades, more powerful than the ace of spades. The two of diamonds wins that trick. It's because it's the most powerful trump. Now, when you apply that kind of thinking to how rights take priority, the priority of rights, you think of something like social custom. Things have been done this way for a long time, and they stabilize society. Personal benefit. This is going to advance my job, advance my career. I'm going to make more money if I do this. Or the public good. We'll do research that promotes the public good. The public good is a very important good. But if none of these things are acceptable morally, if they are done at the expense of violating the rights of the individual. I'll give you an example of how this works then, of how what I mean by this. Let's take a public good. Let's take research, biomedical research in the name of promoting human health. Well, here's what happened in the United States for several decades. Over 400 African-American sharecroppers had syphilis. And the doctors knew this. And the doctors were paid by the federal government, by the United States government. But what the doctors wanted to know was what happens when someone has syphilis and you don't treat the disease? What complications arise? How long does it take them to die? And how do they die? These are important questions. We should find the answers to these questions. And so that's what they did for decades. They did this in the name of the public good. But anyone who believes in the rights of the individual, human rights in this case, believes that the rights of those individual sharecroppers trumped. That is, they overwhelmed, they overrode, they were more powerful moral considerations than advancing the public good. Rights are equal. So remember, we have a role. Rights protect our most important goods. They limit freedom. They take precedence. They're equal. My rights are no greater than yours, and your rights are no greater than mine. So that's a kind of taxonomy of what we mean when we're talking about rights. We all think we have such rights. That's what democratic representative government is based on, the notion of the rights of the individual, the rights that function in the way that I've characterized. But what about other animals? Well, here we have two important questions asked. Factual questions, what is the case? And foundational questions, who has rights and why? Main factual questions are any animals like us physically? Are any animals like us mentally? Or are we somehow unique in our physiology and in our mentation? Well, physically, it's quite clear that other animals have sense organs, other animals have central nervous system, other animals have a brain. I mean, what could be more obvious than that they resemble us physiologically? Mammals and birds, for example. Pretty clearly, I think that's true. And some people argue fish. But we can kind of put that on the table for now and come back to it in discussion. What about mentally? Well, there are some people who think that other animals, whether it's a non-human primate or a cow or a fox, whatever the animal, there are some people who maintain that there's nothing going on in the mind of an animal. It's empty. There's nothing. There are no sensations, there are no desires, there are no emotions, no beliefs, nothing. And if those of you who know something of the history of philosophy know that this was the view that René Descartes advanced. He argued that animals are natural machines, like wind-up toys. You wind the toy up and the toy runs around. You don't say, oh, look at that little dog trying to run under the couch. The thing is not trying to do anything. It's just a wind-up toy. Well, Descartes thought animals were sophisticated wind-up toys. And one reason he gave for that was that other animals lack an immortal soul. And because they lack an immortal soul, they don't have a mind. They have no mental life. Now that's a pretty irrational view, it seems to me. Let's just suppose, for the sake of our argument, that animals don't have an immortal soul. Well, that has implications as to what happens to them after they die. After they die, they're not going to continue to go on living if they lack an immortal soul. But the fact that they're not going to go on living after they die doesn't tell us anything about whether they're aware of anything while they're alive. I mean, it's a fallacy of irrelevance, as logicians would call it. And as Voltaire replied to Descartes, are we to believe that animals have the physical basis for awareness and so that they lack it? And Voltaire says, don't attribute such an impertinent contradiction to nature. Nature is not that irrational. Well, there are some people who maintain that animals have a little bit going on mentally. Their mental life is nominal in terms of sensations and desires and emotions and beliefs. So they're not Cartesians quite, but they're not robust when they say what's going on in an animal's life. And this is the position of a very influential American philosopher by the name of R.G. Frye, who argues that animals experience pain and pleasure, but they lack beliefs and desires. They don't believe anything, they don't desire anything. And the reason they don't believe anything and don't desire anything is because they can't use a language. I mean, we can talk till we're blue in the face to our cat or dog, but our cat or dog is not going to reply in English or Greek to us. I mean, they might meow or they might bark, but they're not going to start speaking Greek sentences and English sentences to us in response. So Fry says, oh, well, that's why they lack beliefs and desires, because they can't use language. And I think the most sensible and obvious response to Fry is neither can children. You know, I have a little bambino here, a little baby here, and I can talk till I'm blue in the face in English, and the baby's not going to reply by speaking English sentences. But we don't say the baby doesn't want anything. Of course we say the baby wants changed. The baby wants the pin taken out of the backside. I mean, the baby has desires and beliefs, even though the baby can't talk. And if that's true in the case of human children, they can have beliefs and desires even though they can't speak Greek, well, then we can't hold that up as a standard for non-human animals. We can't say, well, they have to be able to speak in order to have beliefs and desires. And then there's this view that the mental life of animals is robust, is full when it comes to sensations and desires and emotions and beliefs. It's a full and robust life that they live mentally, not no life or not a minimal life. And I think this is the view that I accept, and I think this is the view that people of common sense accept. I think common sense supports this view, our best religion supports this, science supports this view, and our religious traditions report this view. Common sense, everyone understands. Everyone understands without difficulty. If I say the dog wants out, or the cat wants out, or if I say the dolphin remembers, or the cow remembers, or that hurts the mouse, or it hurts the chimp, everybody understands that as a matter of common sense. Our best science supports the same finding. Darwin, for example, says that the minds of the animals I've been talking about differ from the human mind in degree and not in kind. There are some things we might know that cats and dogs don't know, but they do know things. There are some things we may want that cats and dogs or dolphins and ducks may not want. But that they want, surely they do. And as I said, all our religious traditions support this way of thinking about animals as having a robust mental life. No religion teaches Descartes. No religion teaches Fry. All religions teach that animals have a robust mental life. They are subjects of a life. They are somebody, not something. They have a biography, not simply a biology. They are living beings who are in the world, aware of the world, aware of what happens to them. And what happens to them matters to them because it makes a difference to the duration and quality of their life. In this respect, they are no different than you or I. I'm the subject of a life, my life. You're the subject of a life, your life. And the other animals with whom we share this planet, they each and all are subjects of their life as well, in the sense I've explained. Now remember, as a muddler, you've got to get through these factual questions, the most important ones of which are any animals like us mentally and physically, and those, and we've gone across that surface. Now the foundational questions is who has rights and why? And there are going to be some positions that if we accept them, animals are going to, we have to conclude that animals don't have rights if we accept certain kinds of arguments. All and only those who are morally responsible might be put up as a suggestion. And what we mean by morally responsible is we mean justly held, accountable for how they behave, entitled to praise or blame because of how they behave. So you think about how ducks behave, for example. You think it's not clear to me I would ever want to say the duck is morally responsible, or shame on you, duck, for behaving as you do. I mean, I might do that in frustration, but I mean, I would never seriously condemn a duck for duck behavior. And so if that's the case, if you have to be morally responsible to have rights and ducks are not morally responsible, then ducks don't have rights. That's the argument. There's just one problem with that argument. And I go back to that little baby I was holding in my arm just a minute ago. Baby's not morally responsible for anything. Does that mean that the baby lacks rights? Well, it would have to if you had to be morally responsible in order to have rights. But we don't think that. Nobody thinks that. Everybody thinks. In fact, the United Nations Declaration of Rights, interestingly, declares that absolute vulnerability requires absolute protection. Meaning that someone like this baby who is absolutely vulnerable, who has no strength, no power, no voice at all in the affairs of the world, if anything, demands more protection rather than less protection, because their rights are greater. Well, somebody might say, you have to be self-aware in order to have rights. You have to not only be in the world as a subject of the life, not only have to experience the world as a subject of the life, you have to know you're in the world. You have to rise above the mere stream of consciousness and know that that's your stream of consciousness. You have to be self-aware, not simply aware. Well, if that's true, what about other animals? I personally think that other animals, I think you can make the argument that other animals are self-aware, and I have made that argument. But I'll bypass that for the sake of argument right now, and just point out that if this is the case, then see what we'd have to say is seriously mentally disabled people who don't grasp their presence in the world, for whom experience is something that happens but in an ununified way. We'd have to say, oh, well, sorry, but you don't have any rights. Sorry, but we could use you in research, just as we use those sharecroppers, and not violate your rights because you don't have any, because you're not self-aware. We don't say that. We don't say that. We just, again, say that they need protected. Their weakness means that we have to use our power to protect them. Or we might say, you can use language. This is similar to the Fry argument that we considered earlier, and I'll bypass that for the sake of argument. Have immortal souls. Have immortal souls. That's why we have rights. Human beings have rights because we have immortal souls. Dolphins and ducks, porcupine and pigs lose. They don't have immortal souls, and therefore they don't have any rights. But see, again, if we think about the concept of having an immortal soul, that makes a difference to what happens after you die. If you have an immortal soul, you go on living. But what difference can it possibly make, logically, to your status while you're alive, before you die? It's again a fallacy of irrelevance. The two ideas are not connected in any logical fashion. And in fact, for the sake of argument again, I'll give you this idea from C.S. Lewis, who some of you might know from his fictional writings. But C.S. Lewis was a great Christian theologian in the 20th century. And he said, you know what, I agree, animals don't have souls. And we do. And people said, oh, okay, I guess we can pretty much do anything we want to them then, huh? Because they don't have a soul. Lewis said, no. You don't seem to understand. If they don't have a soul, then they don't have a life after they die. Yeah. Well, if they don't have a life after they die, then this is the only life they have. Yeah. Well, then we should make it as good as we can, because this is the only one they've got. Rather than they're lacking immortal souls being a blank check for us to exploit them, it becomes a compulsion to protect them, to benefit them. So not only is this, I don't think, logically relevant, but it actually reaches a very different conclusion. Well, suppose the candidate are subjects of a life. That's what it is that underlies our attributing rights to you, and you're attributing rights to me, and our attributing rights to the little baby, and mentally disabled person. They're something is happening to them. They're subjects of a life. There are objections to this because, see, if we take this view that it's the being subjects of a life, then the other animals that I've talked about earlier, the other animals that were shown in the videos earlier, have rights. They have rights because they're subjects of a life, just as you and I are. But there are going to be objections to this. They lack rights because they're not human. Oh, please. I mean, if that's not just sheer prejudice, I mean, there's nothing about the notion of a right that requires that someone be a human being. That's not part of the meaning of the word right, moral right. They don't understand rights. Well, neither does the baby. You can't disqualify elephants because they don't understand rights, unless we're willing to disqualify young children and babies. They don't respect our rights. I suppose what this means is, if I'm out on the Serengeti plain, walking around minding my own business, and a lion sees me, the lion doesn't say, "Oh, that's Regan, he has rights. I won't eat him for supper." I mean, what happens is, the lion says, "Well, that looks like a plump, dinner to me," and boom, I'm gone. I'm done. I'm toast, so to speak. Well, they don't respect our rights, but we don't require this in the human community. We don't require, take the case of a mentally disabled person who say, accidentally sets fire to the house, which can happen. We don't say that this mentally disabled person who doesn't quite understand what they're doing and so on and so forth, not respecting our rights, my property rights, they set fire to the house. We don't say, well, that mentally disabled person doesn't have rights. We don't reason that way when it comes to human beings. So why would we reason that way when it doesn't come to human beings, unless we're going to be prejudiced in favor of human beings? They're under our dominion. Oh, I got it. God gave them to us, that's right. Didn't he? And it says so in the Bible. I mean, it says right there, and God gave the animals to us, and so on and so forth. And that's why they don't have rights. Well, I don't know what you think about appealing to the Bible. I mean, I personally don't think that's an effective way of finding answers to lots of important questions. But at the same time, I recognize that it is a common way of doing things. And so it's important for animal rights advocates like myself to try to answer this question fair and square. And here's the way I answer this question. If you look at what's said in Genesis, where this notion of dominion comes from, if we look at what's actually said there, it says, when God says we're given dominion over the animals, this is to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And if you remember back then in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were not wearing leather tongs, and I mean, they were naked. They didn't have any clothes. So they weren't going out buying fur or buying leather to clothes and so on. They were not interacting with animals as a source of clothing. And in fact, they weren't eating animals either. If you actually look at what it says in Genesis before the fall, what it says in Genesis is that I give you herbs and nuts and every tree bearing fruit, and this will be your meat, this is your food. So when God gave us dominion, what he hoped for us would do, he hoped we'd be animal rights advocates. He hoped we wouldn't kill them for their fur or their feathers or skin, and he hoped we wouldn't raise them for their milk or their eggs or their cheese or their flesh. So I'm perfectly happy to say that under the original condition, God wanted it when God gave us dominion. God wanted us to be animal rights advocates. I suppose this is true or something like it. Animals have rights. As subjects of the life, they have rights. They have rights to liberty and to bodily integrity and to life. Then some of the practical implications, if rights are trumped, then we can't justify injuring animals because of some social custom. We can't say, hey, listen, we've always been eating meat here in Greece. It goes way, way back. We can't. That's not a sufficient justification for violating somebody's rights. You can't say for personal gain, I'm gonna go out and shoot some wild animal and really make a big impression because this will help me get a promotion in my work where my boss is a hunter. That's not a sufficiently good reason for violating somebody's rights. The public good, remember the experiment with syphilis, you can't justify violating the rights of individuals in the name of the public good. Well, if animals have rights, we can't do that either. And all these practical implications apply to the food we eat, the clothes we wear, how we learn, what we do for fun. They apply to all the dimensions of our day-to-day life. Remember I said animal rights advocates are not reformers. We're not after more humane treatment. We're abolitionists. We're trying to end the various ways in which we exploit other animals. We're trying to put the animal abuser industries out of business. That's what we're trying to do. We are, as we said, not working for larger cages, but for empty cages. Do animals have rights? As I said, you can't answer these questions in the media or in opinion polls or in examined traditions, only by thinking independently in the invitation of philosophy. Philosophy's invitation to us is think for ourselves. Think for ourselves. Using logic, being factually informed, freeing ourselves from prejudice. The purpose of my remarks and the purpose for my being here, for which I give you thanks again for the opportunity, is to extend the invitation of philosophy. Thank you.